didn't see you there. You know, I'm kidding. Welcome to my home. I hope you're all staying healthy and safe and indoors. So I want to go straight into the Aristotle. And I have my notes on my phone just so you don't see me rustling with pieces of paper. The first thing I want to start with is I want to sort of tell you exactly how this talk's going to go. It'll last about 10 minutes. The first half is going to be on the first half of the reading. Second half is going to be on the second half of the reading. The way that the reading works, which was chapter 15 of the Cambridge Companion, Finding Oneself with Friends by Patrick Lee Miller. The way I look at the reading is it really is in two parts. The first part is Aristotle's account of philia and the problems associated with it, namely two, which are the instrumentality problem and the self-sufficiency problem. The other half is on nous and sort of Patrick Lee Miller's solution to these problems, but his solutions are actually a little more problematic than the problems themselves, but we'll get into that later. Before that, if you look at the handouts that I have two handouts, one for each section. The first section, at the top, you'll see some helpful Greek terms. Those terms I'll have you look down the list themselves. They're the terms that Miller uses throughout the text instead of translating them. And actually, I put a little asterisk next to philia or friendship because I think I actually agree with Miller that friendship is a really poor translation of the word philia. And if you think of friendship in the modern sense, it can only mislead you sort of into what philia means. Philia is any relationship that has love, so the superiority stuff, the political stuff, I'm sure Shelby can tell you that friendship's a really bad definition of philia. But the translation stuff aside, there are some problems with Aristotle's account of philia, and the first one is instrumentality. Now, what does that mean? In order to understand that, we need to sort of understand the Aristotle, and really, if you learned anything from Book 8, it's that there are three types of friendship. There's friendship of utility, friendship of pleasure, and friendship because of virtue or character. The instrumentality is pretty easy. It's for utility. You're using your friend in a way because they're useful, and that's why you have that friend. You're using them as a tool, as a means to, as opposed to an end in itself, to borrow sort of the Kantian language. Then you have friendships of pleasure, which in a way are also friendships of use because you're using that friend because you love what it results in, which is the pleasure that you get from that friendship. So say you have a friend that you enjoy spending time with, and the reason you enjoy spending time with them is not because of them, but sort of the pleasure that you experience. So it's treating your friend as a means instead of an end in themselves. And then the third type is a virtue friendship, and what differentiates that from the other ones is because you're supposed to love that friend in himself. But sort of the issue is, Aristotle talks about how you use that friend to increase your virtue. But then you're using that friend again. Now, in a footnote in the Cambridge Companion, he talks about what I see as the real problem, and this is on the handout, so it's right there at the bottom of this column. The real problem with instrumentality is what I'll call the slave problem. Now, this is an Aristotle quote, you cannot be friends or philos to anything you exploit. There's neither philia, this is straight from the Nicomachean Ethics, there's neither philia nor justice towards soulless things, nor is there any towards a horse or a cow or towards a slave, insofar as he is a slave. For master and slave have nothing in common, since a slave is a tool with a soul. Now, the problem with instrumentality is you're essentially turning your friends or your philia you're turning them into slaves, essentially. You're just using them. Now, the other problem is, and this is bad news for philosophers like you, is that once you've reached this certain level of eudaimonia, this intellectual eudaimonia, I think Miller calls it the citadel of self-knowledge, which is a fun phrase, is once you've reached this height of virtue and intellectual prowess, you're supposed to be self-sufficient. You're not supposed to have anyone. You're not supposed to need anything that you cannot provide for yourself. So if you look back at the reading on external goods, it's a very exclusivist position, whereas external goods really aren't that useful because you should be able to provide Like, you don't need pleasure, you don't need utility, because those are two things that you can provide on your own. But then the question, why have any philoi at all? Like, why do you need friends? And the answer Aristotle gives is, he's like, well, I don't know. It seems odd that the eudaimon person wouldn't have any friends at all. It seems, he doesn't, he just thinks it's odd, and he just doesn't think that's the case. And he says, well, you turn the friend into another self, and so it's not really another person. It's sort of you're sort of this unit. And from that another self is when Miller sort of takes his, and this is the second handout. We're going to move on to nous. You get to the second sort of half of the reading, which I think is difficult to understand, which is why I've parsed it out in the way that I did on the handout. And I'm just going to go pretty abridged on it, just because it's a little hard to follow. So, if you look back on Aristotle's Metaphysics, you know that the world is composed of holomorphic compounds of form and matter. So a human being is base matter and form. Now, what that form is, if you read De Anima, is nous, which is one of the terms up at the top of the first handout. Nous is intellect, and it's sort of this activity of thinking. So the form is, it's an animating principle. So what makes a person is it's a stack of atoms that have been animated by thinking, which is, sounds in the game, it sounds right. Now, from there, you ask the question, how does this help me understand the problem of self-sufficiency, which is, I think, the main problem that he's answering. Because the answer to the instrumentality problem is, well, they're not really tools, they're just sort of helpers and they're companions in discourse or something like that. But then that leads to the self-sufficiency problem, which is, you don't really need helpers, why do you need that? And the answer is, they're not really helpers, they're not other people. And that's sort of the final understanding of the nous. But we have to get there, which is odd in an odd step. You have to get to the final conclusion of the nous argument, which is there's one self. And if you move from that, if you look on the handout, I've kind of laid out chronologically as it is in the text, sort of his argument, the way he moves. So you go from nous, you recognize that nous is an activity, not a process, so its end is in itself, which is thought. So what the thing thinks about is itself constantly. So it's self-reflection, constant. You can understand the self as an activity of self-reflection, which again, and on the handout there are little stars or asterisks around propositions that I find questionable. I have not completely read De Anima, and so maybe Miller has a better understanding of it than I do, but there are some parts of it that I think are really iffy. So you understand the self as nous, which is this activity of thinking. Now, you imagine that this is sort of the reduced version, you can see the larger version of the argument in the handout. You imagine that you are two people in a room you're both friends because you're both perfectly virtuous, which is, again, contentious, and people in the secondary literature disagree on whether or not philoi of virtue are perfectly virtuous or whether they're equal in virtue. That's something that Miller doesn't argue for, and I think that's fine because it's not what he's arguing, and he's sort of going off of that assumption, and it's not too critical to his argument. But the argument is that there are two people, and that what they're doing is they are engaged in thinking, and that thinking is an activity. And if you understand yourself as just thinking, then you no longer have base matter, which is used typically to individuate objects. So really, you just have, in that room with two people, you just have thinking. There's just thinking present. And so you realize, like, at this height of virtue and intellectual prowess, you realize that there aren't other people in the sense of people. There are other human beings, there are other human bodies, but there aren't other people. There is just one self, the divine self, as Miller calls it. Now, I have some issues with this, and I think it's important to understand where he's coming from. So Miller, I looked this up. Miller's written a series of books about the divine self and sort of this look of the relationship between gods or godliness and humans from the pre-Socratics up to Aristotle. And so really this is a continuation. This is what I was talking to Michael Van Sitters about this. And the whole the whole passage seems very, very platonic. It's not, and this is the real issue I have with the argument's pretty good, and if you can see it, it makes sense, but I don't think it's very Aristotelian. And I think if you read Book 8 and Book 9 on friends, the two big friendship books in Nicomachean Ethics, you'll see it's not really how he treats friends. It's really platonic, which makes sense because it's a continuation of his thinking and his analysis of previous thinkers, and he's trying to sort of wedge this idea into Aristotle where I don't think it fits. Um, if you have any questions about the reading, email me, and just thank you for your time, and I hope you stay safe. Thank you.